All right, and we're back with another edition of NX Show. Today I have like two very, very special guests, Jeff and Victor. So I'm pretty sure like most people know you already, but like just for the sake of new visitors, could you introduce yourself? Maybe Jeff, let's go first with you.
You'd be surprised how few people know us. It's a shame, really. Just kidding. It's for the best. I'm Jeff. I'm one of the founders of Nrwl, and that's really it. I used to be a programmer. I do a lot less programming now. I helped push Victor to create NX, despite his thinking otherwise, that it was a risky thing to do. But that's how I take credit for NX. Victor was hesitant, and I convinced him that we should do it.
Actually, I think it's legit. In that there are a couple of times where like, yeah, it will take too long. Oh, it's not worth it. And then like, okay, he keeps it's being difficult about it during each one-on-one we have. So like, let's just do it. And then it usually takes a fraction of the time, right? So because I'm overly conservative,
that's like the cycle with every innovation that we make is Victor thinking about it, me pushing him to do it, and then him realizing it's a lot easier than he thought it was.
Yeah, and because I think internally, as a person who used to do Agile, and now I'm no longer a fan, right? There was always like a correction that it's a 3-pointer, and it's not been a 5-pointer or whatever, right? So it's always, you always underestimate. So as a result, you're like, let's multiply what I think it should take by a factor of 5 or something, and that way I think it should be. But in reality, it's not as bad. So I grew older, so my estimations became more, more accurate, I think.
What about you, Victor?
Okay, so I'm Victor. Yeah, so same, one of the founders, and I'm the person who I still do a lot of programming. Most of my day is still programming, and I obsessing about things that do not matter, right? Like the quality of paper I use, like 50 different types. I need to pick the one that works exactly right for Tuesdays, because otherwise no good thought will come in. And I'm the one who, I'm architect, whatever, NX, and implement the core parts of NX. And NX.
I just realized that we matched today. We're both wearing the Nrwl Pride shirt and the blazer.
I like it. I like it's colorful. So, and the blazers.
I don't.
Yeah,
at least it's something Nrwl branded.
Yeah, you need to send me over some of those.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So let's get started for today. Like, actually, today we have a couple of announcements and maybe even some unveiling of some new stuff. So before starting, NX 13.5 got out today. The blog post was.
Wait, did you get away with not introducing yourself, or is it just assumed that everyone knows you?
I assume everyone knows myself.
Okay.
No, I'm basically Yuri. You've seen me already in the last show. I'm taking over Brandon's place here to run NX Show and keep going what he basically kickstarted. And I'm recently transitioned to a new role here at Nrwl, and I'm mostly doing the DevRel stuff and leading all things around that. So if you have questions, reach out to me, ping me. I'll make sure to forward it to our team internally. So that's from my side. But yeah, as I mentioned, like most people will probably know me already. So to the announcement, the first one is actually, as I mentioned, NX 13.5 got out, and the blog post is coming tomorrow. We will add some details in there of all the features that went into the release. If you want to have some sneak peek, go to Victor's Twitter. He already posted a short video about like a new feature we were very excited about, which is the new dynamic terminal. So definitely check that out and have a look at the blog post, which is going out tomorrow. Very interesting stuff actually going into that again. Let's come to our next unveiling or release. And Jeff, do you want to go and unveil what you have been working about?
I will try to screen share, which depends on if I've set the permissions right previously. But let me see if I can do it. Is there a way to just share one app with StreamYard?
I'm not sure there should be.
Just close everything else. That's
okay.
That's the easy way.
Well, I'm on my giant ultra wide monitor. How about Victor shares it?
Oh yeah, sounds good. Okay, so let me see. Let me open about to share and close all my personal chat windows in case they, which are appropriate and stuff. Just not something I would like to everyone else to see. Okay, cool. So I'm going to share it. Get ready. Boom. Share screen.
By the way, Yuri, I think your mic might be your earpods or AirPods instead of the
good
mic.
Okay, cool. Can you see what I'm sharing, folks? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Now they should.
So Jeff, you can talk through it.
Sure. So this is a new site that we just launched today. It's called monorepo.tools, and this is something we've kicked around the idea of doing for a while because there are other tools like NX in the space, lots of great tools that focus on monorepos, maybe not exclusively, kind of like NX emphasizes monorepos, but isn't just about monorepos. And so we wanted to put something together that is an objective comparison of the tools that are available, not like saying like NX is the best, but talking about it is from our perspective of like, here are the things we think are important in managing a monorepo. And we seeded it with our own understanding of the different tools available, and also got input from folks working on other tools who can help to give an honest, balanced view of what the options are. So first, we talk about some of the concepts of monorepos because it's become a popular word and it means different things to different people. We defined it how we think about it, but also talked about how other people think about monorepos and what the benefits are and different ways you can go about it. You want to scroll a little bit?
Yeah.
And so we talk about things like what is a monorepo from our perspective, and which we think is like the multiple distinct projects with well-defined relationships are the two key parts of it, which this doesn't hold up with all the tools available. Some of them have different ideas of monorepo, like they can be somewhat siloed, but this is how we tend to think about it. And then if you scroll down, we talk about how it's about tools for segmenting and partitioning into logical ways and reasonable ways, comparing with the idea of Polyrepo. Scroll down, keep going. Then we talk about some of the challenges of why people don't like the idea of monorepos, or maybe problems they've had in the past, and then some of the ways that some of the benefits of monorepos, like what are the things that tend to outweigh those challenges. And then we talk about the ways that these different monorepo tools address the pains that were brought up above. This was a quickly done project with a bunch of folks here at Nrwl. Ben Cabanez did most of the work on this, putting the design together and getting it done really quick. So shout out to him for making this happen. And then down below, then you can see all these looking at different features of monorepos and how the different tools like Bazel, Lerna, TurboRepo, NX, and Lage compare. And there are different ways that we present the information so you can kind of look on the whole. Now, a lot of what these tools do is subjective and is based on different tastes. So that can't be captured here. You really do need to try these tools for yourself, but at least this helps you evaluate what problems are these tools aiming to solve and how do they solve it, and what things are explicitly out of scope and that I'll need to do myself. But anyway, we're excited to get this out there. Take a look. It's open on GitHub. And so if we really want this to be something, if there's anything that we've misrepresented or there's more context needs to be added, please submit a pull request and let us know what you think.
Maybe to get started, because like we obviously, as you mentioned, like we kind of brought this page online to clarify some of the things. Like recently, the whole interest in monorepos got a lot bigger, right? Like we have seen people like tweeting about it, showing their tools off, and like we have lots of experience like in that sector from an our perspective. and maybe we can segue a bit into that and like to understand like where our experience comes from, and also like from the perspective from our side, what is a monorepo about? Like, is it just code collocation? Like, what do we understand, and then how did we basically lay out the tools that are on that webpage of monorepo.tools?
Yeah. Why? Yeah. How did we end up caring about monorepos, Victor?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's actually one of the things podcasters usually say, not to say it's a good question, because, presumably you think all questions, so it's just like noise. Nevertheless, it was a good question.
Just say everything is a terrible question.
Yeah.
And it'll make it interesting.
But essentially, there are two main reasons why we care about it. One is that we came out of Google, where monorepos are used, and some of the experience was very informative, because Google builds all the apps in, not a lot of the apps, in most of the apps in this one giant monorepo, has sophisticated tooling to make that workable, right? So it has downsides, because Google scale, introduce some downsides. Also, Google internal DX perhaps is not as good as it can be, etc. So there are some downsides to how Google does it, right? But overall, you at least can see what the upsides are, right? For example, if you want to share code between two projects, it's very easy, right? If you want to refactor something and update all the projects, it's easier. So you sort of keep everyone latest without reducing multiple versions, with a few exceptions, right? So that was one thing where we saw, like, well, that actually works really well, right?
Yeah, especially us being on the Angular team inside of the Google Monorepo is a pretty. It was a challenging experience, but also like helps you see the benefits of it, because the Angular project syncs into Google's Monorepo every day, so everyone's depending on basically the latest version of the main branch on GitHub of Angular, and with plus minus a day, a day.
Exactly.
But so we would sync it in, then we would test every project that depended on it. So it's thousands of projects are running their test suites with the latest Angular, and we could see immediately what broke, and see, okay, is it a problem in their code, in the application code, or is it a problem in the framework itself? But we could fix it. Like, we could either roll it back right then, like when it's within a day of it being merged and it's really simple, or we could fix it in the application itself or in the framework itself pretty cheaply before a bunch more code has piled on top of the change.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if you look at the scale of those changes, right, you can change something that affects thousands of applications and reasonably land this change in like a day, right? Comparing to some companies where you have like 2 applications, and propagating like a design components change takes like months, right? So there's such a big difference in what you can do. That is like it was sort of it felt like an opportunity to introduce some of this to the world outside, right? Of a few big tech companies that all use Monorepos, right? And the second reason why we did it is that once you start working with enterprises, and we're not only like, well, I think open source is actually a fantastic place for Monorepos. We'll talk about it maybe later, right? But perhaps even a better fit, right? Because some of the constraints of the enterprise don't apply. But even if you look at like enterprises, like larger companies with multiple teams trying to do stuff, most of them, and we started 5 years ago by doing consulting, right? So we would work with them, and most of them want the same type of stuff, right? They want to like work together, right? Share code, improve dev mobility. No one wants a developer to be on this one team and never be able to move to it. Like, everyone wants the same like 5 things, right? And which of course has some costs, but by and large, most of those companies are really on the side of isolation, where different teams don't really work with each other, and any type of sort of propagating changes across those projects is so painful, right? So all of them wanted the same stuff, and we're like, well, Google does have some of it, right? In a way that we personally didn't think will work outside as well, but the ideas are legit, right? They're good ideas that can be introduced in a way that's more palatable, right, to non-Google companies, and all these companies need it, right? So how about we do it? And that was so there is actual demand, right, in our consulting experience, and our previous experience informed us how to address the demand, right? So hence, and like sort of Annex was built, right? The first version was very basic, right? But try to bring some of the benefits of this type of development, right, to everyone outside of the big tech companies like Google or Facebook.
And so when we were talking about monorepos, like I guess like a lot of people are not super familiar like what a monorepo is about, right? So in the monorepo.tools web page, basically we also had a section of like what is a monorepo exactly. So it's not just like having multiple projects in the same Git repository, but not really interaction between them, but like it's also about the whole relationships among them, right?
Yeah. No, that's exactly the point, because if you, and also the type of relationships and what you can do with them, the richness of those relationships, because all of these words are very loosely defined. You can say, oh, I do have some relationship with them, like, but really it's about how strong those relationships are, what guarantees your tools can provide, and what it can do for you, right? So yes, if you put two folders in the same repo with two projects and they don't talk to each other and there is nothing in common between them, one is a Rust project and another one is I don't know, like a C# project, right? Well, that's technically a single repo, but it's not what anyone would consider a monorepo in the sense that, there is nothing in common. You just have two folders next to each other, right? So the idea is that you have to have some sort of, essentially the notion of some sort of graph of projects appear, right, in any monorepo tool. So it has to understand your system, create this representation of it, of different units that have relations between each other, and you can do things to that graph, right? You can say, I would like to run things across it. It can optimize the graph. It can do lots of interesting things with it, right? If you don't have that, if you don't have any notion of that graph behind the scenes, that you don't have to know about that behind the scenes, you don't have the same experience we're talking about, right? So your problems won't be addressed, right? If a bank suddenly takes 10 the applications, say they build 10 apps, put them in the same repo, and nothing changes in how they develop, they're just in the same repo, well, that doesn't change really, that doesn't address most of their concerns. Right, the dev mobility will increase by this. Like there are some things that can be made easier by this, but you're still not in the monorepo space, right? You just have a bunch of source code, like a bunch of files together, right? That doesn't help you as much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you probably also like the main benefit is what you get out of it when you have those relationships, right? Like when you actually start sharing code, because like obviously in like what would be like the opposite of a monorepo, which often like denoted as polyrepo, right? That would be like where you have like simple multiple repositories set up and people collaborate like on those single repositories, and then integration happens at the later stage, right? Either like via Microfrontends, whatever, or via local packages or npm registries and stuff. So it's really like you get the benefit of like pulling things into a single place, and then from the consistency in there. So are the like what are other potential like drawbacks of having a monorepo, like a polyrepo versus a monorepo?
Duplication is a big thing. And so consistency that was brought up a little bit of, like if you have a UI or a UI library or a design system, and you've defined the system, but you don't have an implementation that everyone shares, then everyone's going to have a slightly different version of the button, of the input, and all the other components and widgets as part of your system. So the consistency is one thing, but also the fact that 10 or n number of implementations of this component exists means that it's that much harder to steer in a new direction, to maintain it, to for things like regressions and security and things like that, which security is usually not an issue at the component level, but when you're sharing services and other things like that deal with business logic and authentication and things like that, if you have 20 different implementations of this service, then you have to maintain that 20 times. So it's not just the effort of 20 people have implemented this once. It's whenever you want to change anything about your model, then now you have all these implementations that need to be updated, and it introduces a lot of complexity in your development lifecycle, where you can make changes atomically if everything is in the same place and one place.
No, that's a very good point. Application is it's basically the cost. If you measure the cost of sharing code, right? Because it's possible, obviously, to share code in a Polyrepo. People obviously do it, right? But the cost is high, right? You need to have a separate repo, probably. You can have two packages in the same repo, one of them is shared or whatever. But really, there is, the cost of it usually involves days of work, because you need to introduce a change to the shared piece, publish the shared piece, like propagate the change to the main branch, publish it to some registry, right? Local registry probably, right? Consume it from that registry. And if you have, it doesn't assume that there is one node that you share. But imagine you have a shared that depends on another shared, and like it doesn't have to be a flat graph, right? You can have more than one layer in there. Well, then the cost now becomes, you have to do those 2 or 3 hoops, right, to go to the right level of sharing. Hello, cat. and to go through, and it's just very expensive, especially if you detect at a later point that the change introduced is either okay, Kathy, it's a good time. Go.
Yeah, I think it's not only just like even not just like the cost of sharing, right, but also like setting that up, right? The cat destroyed the mic.
That cat is just so friendly lately, and it's honestly, it's in a way, yeah. So yeah, no, I agree. The complexity of the setup is high. So what it results in is the rigidity of the structure, where you have like one shared library, and you're like, well, I have this one. It takes a week to make a change to that and see it in the app. Introduce another one would be a month of work or months of work, right? And you're like, forget it. It's all shared stuff going to the shared common, something library, right? That's what usually happens. You have like one bucket for, okay, two things needed it. So it goes there because the cost of introducing another node in this graph is too expensive, right? And, so with Monorepos, you don't have that. The cost becomes about the same as just making change in place, right? So you can do it in an hour, right? And when you can do something in an hour, certain nice things happen, right? So you can suddenly say, oh, instead of having one shared library, I can have 10 of them with good relationships, with good responsibilities, with appropriate teams assigned to owning them, right? And you actually have, in a way, because that's one of the arguments people make against Monorepos, like, well, it's going to be all together, it's going to be madness, we won't be able to control it. But it's actually the opposite is true, because of in a Polyrepo setup, the shared code ends up being just through just how it ends up being, because certain things are harder, in very few sort of kitchen sink type of libraries, right? So there is no ownership there, right? It's just all teams kind of co-own it because they need to share it through that, mechanism, right? Whereas in Monorepo, you don't have to. You have actually well-defined items for sharing. So there is more structure, right? There actually is more control over what goes where. You as someone who maintains a particular shared library, let's say you maintain shared auth or something, right? You're the only one who maintains it. No one else can change that folder without your knowing, right? So it's actually the exact opposite is true, counterintuitively, right? Even though it's in one place, the result is more ownership, not less ownership, right?
Yeah, exactly. But it's also like from my perspective, for instance, it's even like being able to try things out, right? Like Jeff made the example of like that central shared component design system library, whatever, right? If you have to release that, first of all, you need to nail kind of versioning, right? And the whole changelog generation stuff, right? And then trying things out means releasing alpha, beta packages, installing them, trying them. While if you're in a monorepo, it's really just creating a branch, right? Running tests, trying it out day or life in the same repo. Yeah, for sure. And yeah, and the whole ownership part is actually a good point as well, because like obviously you need to have somehow also some tooling in place, right? So you don't want to jump into the monorepo space and just like naively kind of throw code together in folders and just like wrap up everything on your own. But you might want to have some guardrails in place somewhere that kind of guide you through stuff. And code ownership sharing, I just posted a link in the chat for people to follow along. We just have had a recent blog post by Miro, which is an Norwegian and an engineer on NX, which means like has a very detailed walkthrough of how you can set NX and module boundary rules to control such ownership, right? To make sure you don't end up in a mess of cross-referencing and those type of things.
By the way, if I could say one thing, so like Victor talked about the cheapness being like the cheapness of creating a new project or library being such an important thing. And I think that's something where a lot of folks who go to Monorepos don't go far enough. Like they still come into a Monorepo with a Polyrepo mindset. So like if you just have a notion of top level packages and you have like 5 packages representing 4 apps and one common thing, you're not going to really have the full benefit of the Monorepo, and it's still a pretty heavyweight and pretty siloed way of thinking about it. Whereas NX, like creating a new library in NX is really cheap and easy, and it gives you some new thing to import. And it's not just for shared; it's actually like even something that's not shared. It's a way of partitioning it in a more logical way, more composable way. But that enables a lot more of the like reducing the barriers, reducing the friction of creating a shared thing. And like, so there are other tools that that still talk in the terms of packages and still get people thinking in the way of like a few packages that are shared. And I think that somewhat limits people's ability to see the potential of monorepos, and so it's like, yeah, this I could see some benefits, but it's not that different from how I'm doing it now, so I'll keep with doing polyrepos. So that's one thing we really try to drive home.
Yeah. In that context, I also like sometimes to mention like the kind of 80-20 rule, right? Like in NX, for instance, like a lot of people shy away from, like, let's say you have like your classic setup with like one gigantic app with like, usually you might have folders in there, right? Where you kind of try to impose some kind of structure, right? And a lot of people shy away of like extracting that into NX libs, simply because they think like, okay, this needs to be shareable and general purpose, and like everyone needs to be able to consume it. And that's actually not true, right? Like it's simply like a separation in like a different structure than having those folders in your application. And so the application could really be just the 20% of bundling and linking features from the library folder together and be your deployment container if you want, right?
No, it's a good point, that libraries aren't libraries for necessarily consuming in more than one place. It's more about, that's why the word monorepo in general, like I wanted to call an NX tool for structured repos and just say, if you want a bit of structure in a repo, have sort of like analogous to like structured programming assumption, right? Where this extra structure of these modules, right, libraries, helps you with many things, with like, imposing larger units, right? Because every module will have public API, so you can have real separation of implementation versus the public API. You can test them in isolation, you can distribute them, blah, 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 right? It's more about just imposing the structure in a way that you don't write all your code in one giant file, right? You have different files with different modules, right? Every module have exports and imports, right? But that extra structure, when you look at the module, like module is not shared. It's not like every module you write, right? Every TS file is imported from more than one place. No, most of them aren't, right? It's just an extra piece of structure that allows you to impose certain things, right? Like the public API of that module, the data compiler can be more efficient at looking at it. It's the same stuff, but at a larger scale. It's saying, how about we have larger modules, with public API, we can test, lint, build them separately, sort of analogously to how you have different, TypeScript files. You don't have one giant file, right, that contains everything. That would be analogous to having like one app in one folder, right? That you can impose some structure within it, but the outside tools don't know about your structure. You have to understand that structure as a human being, and at some point, it's too much to keep in mind and stuff.
Yeah. And like maybe like related to that is somehow also like a common misconception that often comes up, right? Can I use a monorepo with a microfrontend? For instance, here Matteo asks, right? And like a lot of people kind of associate those two things, right? Like a monorepo and the monolith, like it's everything throwing into one like gigantic repository that must imply that those also are deployed together, but that's actually not true, right?
Yeah.
And related to that, we also
Can I make a point that is I think it's an important point that I was looking at Jeff's eyes to see if he's going to reply, but he replied very briefly. But the point is to make that the opposite is true. The point I made before about you can impose more structure, more ownership, right, in a monorepo because the tools allow for that, right? And the second point, once you have that, it's much easier to have a working microfrontend setup, right? In that microfrontends, like basically any system goes through this progression. You have like modules within particular unit of bundling. Then you have like the microservice, micro frontends / microservice, depending if it's front or back end. And then you have like separate systems, separate apps, right? So if you have separate systems, separate apps, the interaction between them is usually fairly shallow, and there is very little of it, right? So them being separate repos usually works all right because there is just so little they have to know about each other, right? So when you make change to one, there is almost no chance you're breaking the integration. You can, right? But it's just the chance is lower, right? If you look at micro frontend / microservices, same applies, right? Is that it's kind of, they're more integrated. They make more assumptions about each other. Yeah, the APIs are more tightly coupled. Not every API or micro frontend or microservice is designed very carefully to be like non-breakable with versioning or whatever. Not really, right? So that they all comprise the same system, consists of many of them, right? So they are more tightly coupled. Them being in the same repo actually helps you to make sure that if you make change to one, the integration works in the same PR, or if you make change to shared code that all of them depend on, right, some sort of schema, etc., that it all propagates correctly in an atomic way, like in a single commit, right? So quite counterintuitively to what most people think, right? Having a monorepo helps with micro frontends. Like it's much easier to have a success because using micro frontends is hard, right? It's most people overuse it. It's very hard to make it right, because essentially what you end up having is sort of like a distributed monolith where different teams build separate things, but there are so many assumptions about each other that it doesn't really work, right? In a like they are not independent in any meaningful sense, right? In a monorepo, you can actually have a lot more constraints and more processes around it. In a monorepo with good tooling, that is, right? Like where you can actually manage it more successfully. And if you look at what companies like ThoughtWorks are doing, right? ThoughtWorks are obviously like famous consulting company that go, and they also make other types of software where they help large companies build software, right? And they use NX. They wrote in the tech radar for Microfrontends specifically, right? That's the trend that they see, that people who use Microfrontends, right, switch to use NX because it's actually it's easier, right? So having code in one place not just doesn't mean that you cannot deploy it separately. It actually means it's easier to deploy those units separately if those units have to know something about each other, right? Like microfrontends or microservices.
Yeah, that's also a good point that you cannot just like create front-end applications with NX, or although like we talk a lot about it, but you can also host kind of back-end applications as well, right? Sorry, Jeff, for interrupting.
No, I forgive you. Yeah, but I think the question sometimes comes from that people associate a repository, like if they're doing CI/CD or something like that, then they think of a repository having a pipeline to deployment. And so there's kind of this assumption that things get deployed together, and which kind of goes against the idea of microfrontends. But you can actually you can think about the two pretty separately. And like monorepos typically have many deployment targets inside them that have different timelines. Like you could have one app that you deploy a bunch of lines of business together, but the monorepo actually, like we have clients who go back and forth between micro front end, like independent deployment or coordinated deployment, or like everything deploying together. But the way that NX allows you to segment your app makes it easy to choose what you want to do and to adapt as you go and as business priorities change.
Yeah, no, it's a good. And also, I would add an extra bonus point to Jeff's bonus point is that. I think why people think this way, that if you, like 5 years ago, especially if you go to like deployment platforms, there was like a strong connection of a single repo to a single deploy. Like point to the repo was there is one build script that comes out of the repo, right, and builds one thing. That's, just most deployment platforms used to be this way, but it's no longer the case, right? If you look at popular deployment platforms today, all the I know that are really popular allow you to basically say, well, I have this repo, and they have some monorepo support. It's either explicitly defined, they say this is monorepo support. That's how you can build a subset, like certain things from your repo, but not all of them, right? And deploy them. Or it's sort of implicitly defined, not explicitly, but they, kind of give you some flexibility points to make that happen, right? So that assumption that I think many deployment platforms used to make no longer holds. I think the popular ones I know of, right, either give you explicit monorepo support, and many of them will have explicit NX support, right, in the future, and it support for other tools as well, right? Because as a particular way of developing gets more popular, right, the deployment platforms sort of catch up, right? For now, if you look at our docs, you will see how to deploy to some of those, right? So you don't get confused, right? It's not that difficult, right? It's really usually like an extra property, like look over here, right? And it kind of works. So what used to be true is no longer true. So if folks use like older tools or remember older tools, it's like understandable why they still have this connection between the repo and deployable.
Yeah. Maybe like slightly related to that is also kind of whether we plan to support Svelte and SvelteKit. Like that is very specific to one set of technologies. Yeah. Maybe to call out there is also that like we have from the Nrwl perspective and NX perspective, we support like natively, if we want, internally a set of tools, right, which we follow and we make sure everything is nicely integrated. Right. But then obviously we can do that much, right? Like we have that many engineers and that much time to follow along those things. But we have like a very cool website, which is nx.dev/community. And NX in general is pluggable, right? Extensible. So you can jump in and actually extend it for those popular tools and provide good support for the community overall. And actually there are already some packages that support Svelte there. So definitely check that out.
Can I also make this one extra clarification? Because it's such a common confusion that NX has basically two layers, which is the NX core, which is analogous to basically, something like Learner, Turborepo, that's sort of the level of support. That is absolutely generic. You can support, Svelte, C++, whatever you want to run, it run the same way. There is no difference, right? So that's the core of it. And then there are plugins for like custom generators, custom source code analyzers, custom executors. That's sort of plugins on top, right? So when it comes to core, everything is supported. There is nothing that's not supported because it's absolutely generic, right? So Svelte will work there, or anything will work there, right? The plugins, separate point, they add something extra that other Monorepo tools don't tend to have, except Bazel, right? Don't tend to have. So if you look at and I connect without, I don't know, pick some super hipster framework of today that we don't have support in a plugin yet, right? Us not having support is the same, or Nx not having support is similar to Learner not having support for it. Is that like it works the same way? There is no downside to using Nx. It's not like something doesn't work and it works in Learner. No, it works in exactly the same way, right? Or in Turborepo. It works in exactly the same way, right? It's just you can get extra if there is support in a plugin, right? And so it's like saying VS Code, like why doesn't it support my, Svelte? VS Code doesn't have to support Svelte. You can edit TypeScript files in VS Code. It's generic, right? NX support is a bonus, right? That doesn't make it less capable than, I don't know, Sublime or something, right?
Yeah.
And the Swiss Army knife to make anything work with NX is the run commands executor.
Absolutely.
So if you look up run dash commands, then you can run whatever scripts you've already got building your thing, and you'll get all the other benefits of NX.
Yeah, it's a better wrapper around like a script command, right? Because like you also get like caching and stuff, which NX uses on it.
Yeah, I will post up a guide in the chat in case folks want to
awesome.
Just read through that guide, and you will see everything. I am sure not able to post it. I will post it in our private chat, and someone else posted it in my chat.
I'll forward. Talking about that, like on the monorepo.tools page, we've also kind of listed out like what, from our perspective, are features that a monorepo management tool or monorepo tool should have. Like, can we talk about that and kind of go a bit into the details of what we think is important, especially like when you start maybe from the small, right? But also when you have to scale to the really large.
Right. And so I can quickly go through. We divided them in a few categories, right? With the fast.
Can I suggest we focus in on policy, the version policy first of which isn't specific to a tool, though tools can guide you in one way or another. But I think is a big thing that a lot of people don't. A lot of people, when going to monorepos, they don't embrace it or don't understand. They see they don't even consider it a lot of times because it's just so unusual. But and maybe don't see the benefits of such a policy, but something that we push towards with NX. So like when we say single version policy, what we mean is that within a context like a monorepo, you agree for everyone in the monorepo, you agree to use one version of any kind of library, first party or third party. So the relationships within the monorepo, there's no versioning between the things in the monorepo. They depend on source, basically. Victor's smirking. I can't tell if it's something else or if I said something wrong.
No, I just remembered the cat attacking me. So, so you can ignore.
You make me so self-conscious. But that's one part of it is like everything in the repository doesn't depend on some 1.1 of other package in the repository, other library in the repository. Everything depends on that, but it's also third-party dependencies. So if you're depending on Bootstrap, like you'll agree that everyone in the monorepo depends on the same version of Bootstrap. And the reason for this is the main reason is compatibility, that you have guaranteed compatibility between all libraries in your workspace. If you create something shared and new, you don't have 3 different projects with 3 different versions of Bootstrap that you have to say, okay, I'm creating a new Bootstrap abstraction and I have to figure out what version of Bootstrap is going to make it compatible with these libraries or how I can make it workable with all these other libraries. So like by having a single version, you never have to think about those things. You just say, like we all depend on Bootstrap X.X and everything can work together, even if it wasn't initially planned for all these things to consume this new library creating. There's the option to do it later on. Now the downside of that is when you need to update that shared version. That's when you you have to get creative in how you do such a cross-cutting update, because if you have a few hundred developers in a monorepo they've got PRs in flight, and this is going to be a big breaking change to move the new Bootstrap in, like the APIs have changed, it's a major version bump, then you've got to coordinate that. You've got to figure out who's going to make the changes to the code, when you're going to make it, how you get the team ready to make a cross-cutting change. Do we want to have 2 versions for some period of time? So there are lots of ways you can manage it, but it is an additional consideration that you wouldn't have before when you had versions. The benefit being that you get the compatibility for free. Like, you never have to think about this additional dimension of complexity that you would typically have in monorepo or polyrepo, because this is a good policy to have even if you're in a polyrepo setup, to have it where you're more or less always on the same version within a couple of days at least.
No, it's actually a good point about the version policy. And I also mentioned what Jeff mentioned, that to move to the new version, right? I mean, you usually don't do it by hand. There is if you have good tooling, you have assistants, in like the tooling can update your source code to match to the new API. Not always, doesn't work perfectly, but works very many times, all right? And so if you use an X plugin, that's one of the advantages of having an X plugin, in opposite to going just core, as you would, with other Monorepo tools, right? Is that they manage those updates for you. If you use a React plugin for an X, and if you move, or Next.js plugin for an X, or Remix plugin for an X, if you move to a newer version, it will look at your project configuration, how you configure, say, Next, right, and everything else. It will update it to match the new version, so it's easier to do those large changes across a big monorepo. And I would like to make it, well, the tooling does 99% of the work, right, or like 95% of the work. So for a lot of repos that are pretty big, right, we're talking about, I know, hundreds of developers contributing to a couple of apps, right, a couple of large apps, right, you can make those changes really in a few hours, because most of the heavy lifting is done by the automation that is built in, right? But in general, yes, there is a cost to it. But the upsides are just so great. People who never used it, who don't understand how costly versions are, right? Like if you look at any learner repo that use Yarn Workspace or something, Yarn Workspace perhaps the worst thing that happened to the JavaScript community in terms of their understanding of monorepos. It's a useful tool, but it's useful in like 10% of the times compared to where it's used, right? So when you need it, right? But people overuse it, and as a result, when you see it, you're like, okay, you have like 7 versions of this library in your repo, right? Just organically, over a period of time, it happened this way. Which one do you think is used in production, right? If you ask a person, no one knows, right? It's just somehow it all compiles in some way. Webpack picks up one of them somehow, right? And it's just like, that's not a good situation to be. Once you start sharing code and you're saying, well, that library is built for version 1, that one is built for another version, you consume the library. It may work, but it doesn't have to, right? There is all of those things suddenly kind of don't work reliably. You have duplications of libraries, like really bad things happening, because versions essentially is an extra dimension in your graph. Instead of having a graph that's flat of project, you have versions where for every project there are different versions of it in a graph, right? And now you are in a spot where you say essentially you're like, what are you like you need to imagine it as a human being, which is hard because you don't see in the source code, right? It's sort of hidden. So what Jeff recommends and what Google does and many companies do is saying, well, if you look at a monorepo with first-party code in it, so you look at a learner repo with 10 projects in it, those 10 projects always have one version, right? They all depend on each other in the same repo. It's only third-party code that can vary, right? Single version policy says, well, how about we go a step further and just assume that everything has a single version? To a much, with like asterisk, like as much as possible, right? That doesn't always work, but let's push it further, right? And make as much as possible, get rid of versions, so different versions, right? And like the nice properties that come out of it are just a much simpler to understand model, where you can ask what version of it, this version. You can ask folks, find the versions used in production, you're not merges folders, and they can find the right folder and find the version, so they can actually debug stuff or make changes to it in a much more confident way. It's like, it's hard to convey how much better this is, right? Unless you sort of commit to it, and there are costs or whatever, right? But you're like, oh my god, just the simplicity of it is very good, right? For especially for like messy enterprise projects, when you look at them and they're like, no one knows what's going on there, right? Just all sorts of versions appear, disappear, right? Like for them, going to a single version policy is usually like just such a simplification that has a huge impact on the velocity of the team, right?
But also in terms of tech depth, right? Like I feel like upgrading obviously has like a bigger effort, but like you have to kind of look into it, upgrade the entire monorepo. But usually it's also the case where when you upgrade, like errors that you might encounter are very common, right? Like, or similar.
Yeah.
And so in the phase of upgrade, you kind of build up the knowledge already, which otherwise you either like have those different versions sparse throughout the thing, and like you will upgrade like maybe in a year, right? Like when the individual teams come around it, and everyone has to get that knowledge of fixing those.
Oh yeah, it gets hilarious.
So,
yeah, it gets so bad. But people want to upgrade in different times, right? And then different versions of different tools require different versions of Node. Right, Node.js, like it's all tied together through like it's just all JavaScript ecosystem is built with like tape, and so you can go to one folder or have to use Node 8 or Node version, get out of the folder or back to Node 16. It's like that's madness, right? And that's many
especially
companies.
If you scale up.
Yeah, people develop this way, and it's like that is the state you don't want to be in. So you can be in it. NX obviously doesn't prevent you from doing it. You can.
Well, I think one of the more helpful ways to think about like breaking change upgrades between a single version environment or a multi-version environment is like the difference between paying cash for something versus getting a high interest loan for something. So with Polyrepos or without a single version policy, you're going to pay that cost over time, but it's going to be a lot more expensive. So like everyone can update when they go, but you have this additional dimension of complexity, and you have the repeated effort, like the increased effort each time that each person needs to relearn the things 10 other people have already learned while upgrading the dependency in their branch. Versus if you just do it all together and you get a small team who's owning this change for a week or something, however long it takes to make it. You see the cost more, like you see this lump sum payment that like you're looking at it at once and it seems larger than the overall cost, but the overall cost is significantly higher when you spread it out over time and across teams.
In terms of scaling, like there has also a question come up, for instance, like how do IDEs handle huge monorepos, and what are the experience on our side with that?
Yeah, I mean, what define huge? Okay, so if we're talking about Google scale monorepos, okay, those cannot be checked out, right? You have to have completely custom tooling for everything, right? So to deal with most 99.999% of all monorepos are much smaller, right? We're talking about 10 million lines of code, 20 million, like that's the scale where like people think it's huge, and it's a big repo, especially for like if you look at the JavaScript ecosystem, right? But it's not that massive when it comes to but I will give you sort of one example. If you have a monorepo and let's say you use Yarn workspace or something in that thing, we have different node modules folders, right? Or you have a monorepo with a single version policy. The node modules folder is going to be, I don't know, 9, like the vast majority of, like if you have multiple copies of node modules because Yarn workspace is linked, okay, the amount of indexing your IDE or your editor has to do, like balloons, you have to like 10x more indexing. Right? So because you just have like 10 gigabytes of node modules in different folders spread out, right? If you use a single version policy, your node modules folder is a fraction of it, right? So comparing to your node modules folder, your source code, it doesn't matter. Okay, it's just so small, right? I dare you to show me a repo where the source code that you wrote is in any way comparable, right, to the node modules that you have, right? So in reality, it kind of doesn't really matter that much, right? I have never experienced, and we work with a lot of clients that have like large projects, like massive project, 100 developers building it, like by most measures, we would consider to be big projects, right? The CI time can be like a 10-hour item. A lot of stuff is happening there, right? And the editor or like VS Code and WebStorm handle just fine, right? That's never the bottleneck of anything, right? Like there are other things that are bottlenecks. If you have a very big app, there are certain tools that start, kind of poorly. Nothing to do with monorepo. It's just a thing that happened that you need to address. Or CI, right? CI can get slower in the monorepo if you don't have right tools, because if you have more 20 apps in the same repo, well, if you don't do anything, your CI is going to be 20 times slower, right? So you have to do something interesting in your CI to make the CI time very fast, right? But again, that's not the editor stuff. The editor stuff, can handle much larger project, no problem, right?
I think a good plug here would be also for NX Console. Like that is something that we also developed now, right? Which integrates with Visual Studio Code, which is an extension basically. And one thing that if you have lots and lots of projects there, NX Console will help you, for instance, like not only to identify new commands in NX, right, which you might not be familiar with. So I feel like it's a very good way to kind of explore the capabilities, right? Explore commands you have, like for generating projects or running builds, but also to navigate within the actual project, right? So. And the newer versions of NX Console are getting better and better, even helping you like to find the proper imports and supporting Visual Studio Code in there, but also like to navigate around within the project and jump quickly between them. So definitely, if you haven't tried it out, definitely check that out. That will help as well. Not in terms of like the question in terms of scaling, but like of navigation, organization of that repository.
Yeah,
But
I always use NX
Yeah,
Console. I never use CLI anymore because I can never remember flags since I never write code. So
no, NX Console rocks. Like the team did an amazing job. Just auto-completion. The fact that you can go to any configuration file to auto-complete based on the metadata provided by plugins and stuff is pretty cool.
Yeah. Related to that also somehow towards the types of toolings, which you have also mentioned on the Monorepo tools. Like one question that has come up is that a person mentioned that they started learning Bazel and found it more difficult to configure, and therefore they are kind of asking like, what is the main difference between NX and Bazel? So maybe we can go quickly into that.
Oh, that's actually this is a fantastic question because
the short answer is go to monorepo.tools
exactly.
and we lay it out. And Alex Eagle, who works closely on Bazel and is a friend of ours, has helped contribute to that as well.
Yeah, exactly. So and we didn't put things like hard to use that much, I think, in the website, because hard to use and configure, we know certain things are harder to use, right? So I think Bazel is a fantastic tool, but it's harder to use, right? For if you're outside of a large tech company, because it makes more assumptions about stuff, right? It's more different. It's different from what you're used to, etc. So I think it is harder to use, but the site doesn't talk about it that much because you should really try it and decide. Like if you're a Googler with like 10 years of Bazel experience, I mean, you can probably make it work just fine, right? So it's harder to use for people who are not in that, doesn't have certain knowledge, right? I think that in terms of comparison, in general, I would say that Bazel is super powerful, right? It's the thing that we are trying to do with NX is take some of the stuff that Bazel does, and more, but in terms of like performance and scaling, and say, okay, so what does Bazel do? Like, how does it scale, right? Can we scale in a similar way? Maybe not to that degree. Maybe NX cannot drive a Google scale Monorepos. It can't, right? But for vast, like the 99.9% of all organizations there, they will never reach that scale, even remotely, right? Like Git doesn't work for that scale. If you can use Git, you can use NX. Your repo is normal size for us, right? So, and we'll look at how can we make that use case just much easier to use for people who cannot get Bazel, right? Just they're trying, they're struggling, right?
Is there any way you could quantify like what that point looks like in terms of like number of developers, number of projects in a repo, where like it starts to be the tipping point of the additional complexities warranted?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think that what it boils down to is that what we try to emphasize is sort of the zero or close to zero config. Okay, so people are always like, well, NX is a lot of config. The plugins have config, right? Which you replace, let's say, Webpack config with a plugin config, right? But if you look at NX core, there is no config, right? The single file that configures the CLI, that's it, right? So there is one file which is this long. That's the whole config for a repo. If you don't use any plugins, regardless how big your repo is, your repo can be enormous repo with like hundreds of projects. That will all the config we need. Zero config is important because most developers, like in most organizations, don't know or don't want to write config, all right? So we do that, but for this to work well, we need to look at your workspace and figure out, well, we need to understand your project graph, right? Because like in Bazel's case, you configure your graph, right? Using build files. And here, like we need to understand it, right? And we need to do it in a way that doesn't bother you, right? So you develop as normally, but we kind of know your project graph and you can view it and you can see what's going on in there, right? That understanding requires us to analyze your graph, right? And it takes time, right? For the the vast majority of projects, that understanding, and we are smart about caching stuff on disk to never reanalyzing everything from scratch, blah 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 blah, right? So, but at some point, if you have billions of lines of code in your repo and millions of files in it, well, Git won't work, but we also won't be able to understand it fast enough, right? So at some point, if you're like looking at Uber or something, right? We have 10,000 services and we want to move it in a single repo. Well, the amount of code will be so big that we won't be able to just comprehend it, right? Intelligently, right? So the vast majority of projects aren't in that spot. I would say if you can git clone something, Nrwl will find, they analyze it, no problem, right? So if git clone works for you, Nrwl will work for you. When git breaks for you, because the repo is
but a lot of people assume
work.
that Git can't scale to certain points, but it actually can scale.
Git can be can support enormous repos. Okay, so you'll be surprised how small most repos are, right, in comparison to really large projects, right? Most people who talk about we have a large project, that project isn't a large project on a scale of large projects. Okay, it's not Microsoft Office. Okay, so so most of the time, if you can git clone something reasonably fast, right, and actually no problem handle it. But if at some point you're at a scale where your giant organization with 10,000 developers wants to move in a single repo, well, maybe Bazel is a solution for you, all right? But then it's not just Bazel solution for you. GitHub will no longer work for you, period, right? So just the UI will break, right? Like nothing will work for you. The Azure won't work for you. You go through it, every single step that you want to look at will likely not work for you. You have to build your custom stack from scratch, all right? So it's not that you pick between Nx and Bazel. You're like Nx plus all the tools you already know. If anything, chances are the first thing that's going to break won't be in terms of scaling, won't be Nx. Things like GitHub and other things are the first one that you will see a lot of friction and it will make it harder, right? So that's sort of the choice, right? There are some projects that only Bazel can run them, right? Because they are so, like some repos are there, or Bazel or similar tools like Puck and stuff, right? And that's fine. So we are aware of it in a way that GitHub doesn't try to handle everything in the world. GitHub works for very large repos really well, right? And they're not trying to work for if you have 10 million files and you have a PR that touches 10 million files, no, that is not going to work on GitHub. Okay, so, and it's fine, right? Yeah. The vast majority of companies,
you need a lot more than the build tool to handle those things. Like Google and other companies who have monorepos. There's a lot more to the stack than just Bazel. It's like everything is custom.
To the degree that if we look at say GitHub or let's say Circle CI and GitHub, the combination or something, right? And you have a large enough repo, the first thing that's going to fail isn't in terms of your ergonomics, right? Isn't Nx going to be fast enough? No problem. What's going to fail is just the ergonomics of looking at your CI output. You look at that and you have if you have 1,000 projects in a repo, which is a sizable Nx repo, it's just going to be sea of text, right? With a lot of stuff printed out. And it doesn't matter if it's an Nx or Learn or something. Any monorepo with 1,000 projects in it is going to be unusable in CI. Unusable, right? So Nx Cloud is a solution for that. That thing that breaks first is not the Nx performance locally. It's your CI, the ergonomics doesn't work. So Nx Cloud fixes it by giving you a much nicer way to examine those large outputs. Filter similar to how Google does it, actually. So, there are many, many things that are going to stop working before Nx is going to stop working or your editor is going to stop working. Usually that's not a problem, right, for you.
Yeah. Related to that is some question and that came up in the chat as well, actually, is from Nicholas, actually, is what size does my project have to be, right? Because a lot of people, when they hear this, the masses that you can scale up, right? And what features you need to have in order to build those huge monoreps, they're like, okay, I'm not in that range, right? So my repo is much smaller, my app is much smaller, my team is just 5 people maybe, right? So what are typical scales? Do you get benefits also if you have a small repo? What are those benefits? Or what's the opinion there?
Yeah, I think of it as what size do your project has to be for it to be for you to use TypeScript and derive some value from it, right? So it's similar in that TypeScript is obviously the bigger your project gets, the more indispensable TypeScript becomes, right? For the smaller one, you can do away with it. If you have a 10 million line project in JavaScript, okay, it's super hard to maintain. It's borderline impossible, right? With TypeScript, it is possible, right? So the bigger it gets, the more indispensable it becomes, right? But it's used for the smaller scale as well. I write scripts in TypeScript, right? That are this big. It's for me, there is no cost because I know TypeScript well, right? Same for a repo. If you have a repo with a few projects, or even one, you think of it as one project, but no project is one project. You have an end-to-end test next to it, some example app, a bunch of other things, right? It's usually a handful of things, right? Even for a small project, right? Even for that thing, I think it's the cost of adding Nx is low, right? So it is worth it. But if you are trying out, if you're just learning a new framework and you know absolutely nothing about it and just want to try it out, well, I don't think Nx will be give you that much, right? Just yeah, you can do the bare bones setup, right? It can give you a little bit, like if you're learning, for example, like React or something, right? And if you're a new developer who's sort of less experienced, right? Maybe the bootcamp or right after the bootcamp, something like that, right? An X console can be helpful because then you can build your React app and like VS Code, like generation, like just the assistant that the React plugin that we build will be helpful even for a small project, right? So it's not even that for small projects, X will be only the cost. There are enough benefits that for someone who is really junior, those affordances can be helpful. But I would say for pretty much any project, right? In a way, the TypeScript is helpful for pretty much any project, right?
Yeah.
And
it's even already just taking away the burden of like configuring all this stuff, right? As you see, like TypeScript setup, Cypress, like I feel like all those generators and like being able to focus on just like the feature production rather than like understanding how to like run Cypress and like an application like both at the same time in order to be able to see your tests running live, right, on your development code while you code along.
Right.
So for sure. We're already kind of over, but I would like to just like mention maybe the like what are the, from our perspective, which we also mentioned on monorepo.tools, is what are the three main things, top three main things, like what we think is like important to have in a monorepo tool. Like what would those be from your perspective?
We could focus on the things that so that like the managing of code and like structure of the repo, I think is a pretty, and we talk about that in the monorepo.tools site of like why we think these things are actually not a distinct problem to solve from monorepos. It's actually like pretty related into having a successful monorepo. Like having tools that help you manage code, especially like one of the features we don't talk about enough with NX is migrations. That with our plugins, we ship migration scripts that when you upgrade them, they'll automatically modify your code to be compatible with anything that's changed or deprecated. So like a tool that understands your code can help you understand the relationships between your code and generate and update and things like that. Goes a long way and really helps ease a lot of the friction or a lot of the pain of working in a large monorepo with a large team with a large code base.
I actually agree with Jeff. I think that there are two dimensions of scaling, right? And monorepos aren't just good for scaling, good for structure and whatever. But if you look at scaling, right, you can scale like performance-wise. So like you can run bigger repos fast, right? In CI, for example, right? And actually something we hear from clients was the repo grows like 5x or 10x because they move apps into that repo, right? But the CI time drops, right? Because NX helps you to make CI faster, right? By just caching, distributing, and doing smart things, right? So like the repo got 10 times bigger, the CI time got like 4 times faster. It's not uncommon. It actually happens. Right? That's one property, right? The fast part and the scaling part in general, right? Because your repo will presumably be a bit bigger, right? Most monorepos, once you have it, it's so cool. Different teams join in. You have to be able to scale, right? Horizontally scale to make sure that you can run it on many machines and your experience is good and your CI and local experience is good, right? And the second part is organizational scaling, which I think is what people don't normally talk about because it's not hip. People don't talk about it's usually you see like sort of all the architects, like blah, 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 organizational scaling, Conway's law, blah, 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 right? And they talk about that, and sort of the youngsters talk about, hey, I can make it fast, just cache in, And but the other part is actually more important for most companies, right? They can make things reasonably fast through just hacks and stuff, right? It's not going to be super great, but they can try to make it perform okay. Whereas organizational scale, like making sure your code is maintainable, right, and that ownership is defined, you have these relationships in the code that are well expressed, that is very hard to do unless you have good tooling, right, that supports you. And people always miss it, right? They always focus on the fast part because you can show a number, 10 times faster, right? Very tweetable, right? Whereas maintenance of code is very hard to define, etc., right? And coming back to the thing that we asked before about microfrontends, right? Things like that. If you want microfrontends to work, which is you want to have systems consisting of units that are loosely coupled to each other, you have to have some invariants to guarantee that loose coupling persists, right? If the coupling becomes, more intense, right, then your microfront is going to be a disaster. Right, you're just going to have a nightmare of an experience. So that to guarantee that it persists requires some extra tooling, and anyway, so I think that's for company that's what matters. If you're an open source project with 50 packages in it, you can probably work it out without because you have a small core team that manages everything, right? Then performance perhaps is more important. But for any company, like a business, we have different lines of business doing things, right? Organizational scale will be the first thing that you hit, right? It will be a problem. And then performance you'll still hit just later on, right?
And there is a relationship between the being able to organize your code and to maintain the code and the performance, because like NX, because it makes the idea of libraries or projects so cheap, like because you can have so many more projects than you would typically think in like a packages mindset. It enables NX to do a lot more optimizations with with incremental builds, with distributed cache, with distributed task execution, to where it has a lot more flexibility in how it can distribute the load across different machines.
Yep. Sounds good. All right, so we are actually already over time. To wrap this up, like I highly suggest people check out our newly released monorepo.tools. This is just the first version, so we just actually released it today. We worked on it very hard last week, and what we try to do is, like, at a higher level, provide some education, if you want, about monorepo tools in general, NX, and all the other options that are available. And we will keep updating the site and add new things on there. One thing, for instance, which we also released today is a free book on effective React development with NX. So you can download that from the webpage directly, so from monorepo.tools. There's a lot of the details which we've talked about today, for instance, are in there, like module boundary rules, like how to scale with affected commands, and React-specific things, obviously, in detail. There's also a book there, Enterprise Angular Development, from Manfred Steyer. So if you're more in the Angular world, that's a highly recommended book that goes a bit into domain-driven development, like how you can use that within NX and structure workspace to work effectively in that space. In terms of the monorepo.tools, also, as we mentioned in the very beginning, we set this up. We had people collaborating, like Alex Eagle, Kenneth Chow, and so on. And we have a link at the very top, which links to the public GitHub repo. So if you feel things are missing, definitely chime in, reach out to us, chat with us. And also, always a good place is join our community Slack. So we have a completely community-driven Slack where there are a lot of discussions about monorepo in general, but also very specifically in React Native, React, Angular, and so on. So definitely check those out and reach out to us on Twitter if you have more questions. Thanks a lot for watching this with us. And thanks, Jeff, Victor, for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.